Hey everybody, today I am down in Southern California driving the newest member of the CRV family. It's this model right here. It's the first plug-in hybrid CRV available in the United States, but it's a plug-in hybrid with a twist, because when this is not running off of its battery, it's running on a hydrogen fuel cell stack nestled right under the hood. This is of course not Honda's first venture into hydrogen, but this is the first time we're getting a plug-in hybrid system, the first ever hydrogen plug-in hybrid in North America, and the first hydrogen-powered vehicle by Honda built in the United States. Now, before we get to the rest of the video, I will say hydrogen and hydrogen fuel cells are pretty controversial. So I'm going to save all of that discussion into where does hydrogen come from? Is it green? Is it not green? Is it a good idea? Is it a bad idea? All that's going to happen actually in a separate video. You'll see the link at the end of this video, so if you want to check that out, be sure and hang on to the end of the video and watch that one. Instead, let's just talk about what Honda's built with the new fuel cell CRV. The reason these two CRVs are next to each other is because the one on the right is a regular hybrid model. This one is the CRV FCEV. And E is, of course, Honda's new electrification initiative. You're going to see the E badging on a lot of other electrified Hondas. And then, of course, the FCEV is because fuel cell EV. They have created a new front-end design for the FCEV version of the CRV. You can see the difference over there between this regular hybrid model. I actually kind of hope that this hybrid design, the fuel cell design actually makes its way into the other CRVs, because I kind of like the change here. So we have a chrome strip here. We have a slightly redesigned front bumper. You can see that the front end is ever so slightly longer because of the cooling requirements and the differing packaging dimensions of the fuel cell stack. Now, speaking of the fuel cell stack, we should dive under the hood first and take a look at that. Under the hood, we find one of the most compact and one of the most advanced fuel cell systems ever put into a passenger vehicle. The entire fuel cell system lives now under the hood. It's about the size of a 2-liter 4-cylinder engine and transmission, which is definitely a big improvement over some first-generation fuel cell systems, because those occupied not only the space under the hood, but also some places under the passenger compartment as well. Power output from this system comes in a little bit lower than the outgoing Clarity, 92.2 kilowatts. Power from the electric motor, 174 horsepower, 229 pound-feet of torque, driving the front wheels. There are a few interesting things about this fuel cell system. The first one is Honda has really reduced the amount of precious metals that are used inside the fuel cell stack. They say the stack is now 50% less expensive than the one used in the Clarity. The other interesting thing, this was designed in coordination with General Motors. It's actually going to be built in a joint venture factory as far as the cells. But the vehicle itself, that's built in the Honda Specialty Manufacturing Factory in Ohio that formerly built the Acura NSX. Kind of makes sense for a relatively low production vehicle like this. This is only going to be leased in California at the moment. There's a possibility it might come to Hawaii and, of course, some other places around the world that hydrogen is available in. But in North America, it's just going to be California and perhaps Canada. Over here we find the J1772 charging port, no DC fast charging for the just under 18 kilowatt hour battery pack on board. And then back here we find the hydrogen filling port, pretty much the same location that we have with other hydrogen vehicles. That's what the hydrogen nozzle looks like. Interesting twist, I actually owned a hydrogen fuel cell vehicle for 3 years. I had a Hyundai Nexo. So if you want to ask any particular questions about that experience, be sure and hang on, check out that other video, or just post down there in the comment section. Now to the downside. Here's the cargo area back here in the hydrogen CRV. And here is the cargo area over here in the hybrid CRV. You will notice it's a pretty big difference. The hydrogen tanks aren't quite vertical stacked. One's between the wheel wells, the other one is basically underneath the rear seats, and then the batteries are located sort of in the center line of the vehicle. We have a removable shelf here. You can install it in this upper position, or you can install it in that lower position where you saw it earlier. They've actually made it pretty hefty. You can see it has ribbing under there, and it feels very, very sturdy. And that's, of course, that way you can try and have more of a flat cargo area here. The other thing you might not notice immediately is that the rear seats are actually different than the other CRV. In this hybrid model, when I fold down the rear seats, you'll notice that the seat bottom cushion actually drops down there a little bit, really making that seat back nice and low when it's folded. If I look at the fuel cell CRV over here, you'll notice that not only do we get a different mechanism, we don't have the latch right there on the seat back, but we get a different seat entirely. So if I lift that back up there, you'll notice that the seat bottom cushion does not move when that seat back is tilted. Over here in the fuel cell CRV, you'll notice that the seat bottom cushion does not move downwards when you fold the seat back down. That means that this entire module is higher off the ground. It's actually about 4 inches or so that you lose because the battery pack for the plug-in hybrid system is effectively right there under the rear seats. Now, it's not too much of a problem, of course, because we have that hydrogen fuel tank back there that I showed you earlier, and that's basically the difference between that load area and the seat back when those are folded. If I fold that up, you'll actually see some of the high voltage cabling right there and some of the steel protection area, the safety cage that's around that hydrogen tank. From this angle, you can actually see that the battery pack itself drops down, so this does get a little bit less ground clearance than the regular CRV. As you might imagine, the majority of this interior is borrowed straight out of the regular CRV. We get the exact same dashboard design with the honeycomb pattern going on right there on the dashboard. I think it's an attractive look, but I have noticed that this is a little bit difficult to clean if you live in a dusty area. Up here on the infotainment system, we get, of course, a different power flow meter because this is what's showing us the status of the plug-in hybrid system, our electric range over there, and the fuel cell system right over there. 230 miles currently on this tank of hydrogen. There are actually those 2 tanks back there, and they store just over 4 kilograms of hydrogen. Battery electric range 20 miles. It does appear to be adaptive, so as I was driving one around earlier today, the electric mileage range shot all the way up to about 40 miles because I was driving it gently, and the hydrogen range shot up to about 280 miles. Obviously, your driving style is going to change that. This looks a lot like the old Clarity, whether we're talking about the hydrogen Clarity or the battery electric Clarity. The rest of the software, though, it's right out of the regular CRV. Other than the software changes, the upper portion of the dashboard is exactly the same 2-zone climate controls there, same air vents right over here in the middle of everything. Down here we have a push button shifter rather than the more traditional console shifter that was in the hybrid models we were driving earlier today. Over here we have the drive mode selector. These are our typical drive modes like normal, sport, econ, and snow. The new one for this model is this EV button over here. And if I look over here on this side, you'll notice it goes through things like auto mode, EV mode, the save mode, and if I press and hold it, it's actually going to engage a charge mode. The battery's a little too full for charge mode right now. I'll talk about this more in the drive section, but I think that the charge mode makes a bit more sense than I thought initially. Down here we have 2 big cup holders, a softly padded center armrest with lots of available storage, as you can see right there. Everything here is basically lifted right out of the regular CRV, as is the full LCD instrument cluster right over there on that side. You can see it's not the largest LCD instrument cluster, but it does fill up that gauge system quite nicely. Moving up to the ceiling, you'll notice we don't have a moonroof in here. That does mean we get a little bit more headroom than in the top-end trims of the rest of the CRV lineup, but if you want a moonroof, you're going to have to look at one of the other options. Now, as far as the seating goes, seat comfort and seat roominess figures are identical to the rest of the CRV lineup because of how they integrated the plug-in hybrid system into the vehicle. And these are still very, very comfortable front seats. So if we move down here, we have the power adjustment mechanism, no 4-way lumbar. That's still something I would love to see in the CRV. But I think that the seat design itself is certainly one of the most comfortable in this segment for my body shape, and there's plenty of headroom both front and rear, partially of course because we don't get that sunroof. In the back, I was surprised that the seat bottom cushion is not higher off the ground than in the hybrid model. It's actually the same height off the ground, although again, we don't have that mechanism that allows it to drop down for additional storage space. Rear seat passengers also get some rear seat air vents there, USB charge only ports, and we do get a little bit more room in here than we find in the Nexo or in the Mirai. The Mirai has a pretty tight back seat. The Nexo, it's a little bit narrower. The roofline is a little bit lower because it's really more of a small hatchback rather than a compact crossover like this. So you definitely get a little bit more room in the fuel cell vehicle. Now, moving to the back, you'll notice one of the other design changes here, which are the frosted white tail lamp modules. They illuminate red when the lights are on, and that is definitely a bit different than this hybrid model over here where they're just red all the time. All right, it's time to get the CRV fuel cell out on the road. Obviously, it's going to drive just like an EV because that's the core thing about fuel cells is that they are at their heart actually still EVs. It's just that the battery is a little bit different. In addition to the regular battery, we have the fuel cell stack under the hood. But because the maximum power output of the battery pack is less than the motor's total demand, there is going to be a different feel depending on the mode that you're in. You can choose EV only mode where it's actually going to save that hydrogen fuel cell stack for later, Or you can choose auto mode, where it's going to prioritize the power source based on whatever you're commanding from your right foot. There's also a save mode, and there's a charge mode as well. So if, for instance, you want to make sure that you use up as much hydrogen as possible before you get to the hydrogen station, you can move over to that charge mode, where it's going to charge the battery pack, and then of course allow you a little bit more of a fill up because it's consumed more of that hydrogen. Bearing in mind I have not been able to drive this for very long, I have been able to do some really quick 0 to 60 testing down here in Torrance. This model went 0 to 60 in 8.3 seconds if the fuel cell stack was not on, and that dropped down to 8 seconds if the fuel cell stack had already been initialized. And that's because it does take just a little bit of time for the fuel cell stack to get started. Once the stack has been initialized, this is able to run 0 to 60 8 seconds time after time after time. And that is just a tiny bit different than the other fuel cell vehicles available in North America, mainly due to the size of the battery pack. The battery pack in a Mirai or a Nexo, it's about a kilowatt hour to a kilowatt hour and a half, depending on the model we're talking about. So basically the same size as a regular hybrid battery pack. And that's again because the fuel cell stack does not put out enough power for this motor to run at full bore constantly. It is ballasting it effectively with the battery pack in the rear, but this vehicle has a bigger battery pack, so it has a bigger ballast. Now, because it has a bigger battery pack, the stopping distance seems to be a little bit longer than some of the other options out there. About 120 feet from 60 miles an hour back to 0 in my very, very early testing down here. You will likely stop shorter in a regular CRV hybrid, but that's pretty logical because this is going to be a bit heavier than a regular CRV hybrid. However, weight is definitely an advantage for a fuel cell vehicle in general terms, because generally fuel cell vehicles are lighter than some comparable battery electrics. We'll talk about that in a different video, of course. Stay tuned to the end because there are so many different factors here. It is possible to make a battery electric vehicle with better performance than this, obviously, that weighs less than this. But it's also possible to make a fuel cell vehicle lighter than the one that we're talking about here if it had been specifically designed for one. And this is really a merging of platforms here. This is the latest fuel cell technology jammed into one of the best-selling small crossovers in America. And even though this small crossover was designed for hybridization from the beginning, it wasn't necessarily optimized for hydrogen fuel cell technology. Rather unfortunately, today's drive route is basically just driving around Torrance, so no winding roads are happening here, but I have to say that the handling feel feels pretty consistent with the rest of the CRV lineup. And because they've moved some weight to the rear, the battery pack is again in the back, I actually kind of like the weight balance in this CRV a little bit better than the rest of the CRV lineup. The lack of all-wheel drive, though, that is a bit of a bummer, but remember, this is only going to be leased in California. You won't actually be able to buy one, at least not at the beginning. It's going to be lease only, California only. And that's kind of the allure of a hydrogen vehicle in a way. It's the ability to drive effectively a production prototype. These vehicles are very limited in number, they're going to be pretty rare, they're quirky technology, there are going to be some compromises here and there when it comes to the fueling, etc. But you're driving something that almost nobody else out on the road has, or has the ability to get really anywhere. And that's logically a reason all on its own to get something like the fuel cell CRV. Now, let's talk about some of the fuel cell components specifically here. Early generations of fuel cell stacks were pretty noisy. They had some difficulty starting up in cold weather. That has definitely been changed for this generation of the fuel cell stack. This is able to start in some really, really cold temperatures, basically colder than you will ever find in California, and you'd be hard-pressed to find colder temperatures than this really anywhere in the continental United States. According to Honda, startups below 0 are absolutely no problem, although they will take a little bit longer than starting up when it's 60 degrees outside like it is today. So the climate will, of course, have some bearing on that. But unlike other fuel cell vehicles, we have the big battery pack on board. So even though it may take a little bit more time for the fuel cell stack to come online, you can still move because we've still got the battery. If you've ever driven a fuel cell vehicle before, you're probably aware they can make some funny noises, sort of hair dryer noises under the hood, but this is quite different. If I floor it here, no weird whirring noises. Honda has really taken a lot of time to quiet this fuel cell down. And there's another reason it doesn't make as many whirring noises. We've got the big battery pack in the rear. And that's just one of those advantages of being effectively a plug-in hybrid vehicle. For the same reason that we find reduced engine output necessary in regular plug-in hybrids. This doesn't have to crank the engine, or the fuel cell stack if you will, all the way up to 100 right away. It can ramp it up actually as you accelerate. And that really means drivability improvements. It's quieter in the cabin, etc. The bigger battery pack also resolves one of the other things that you'll notice in other fuel cell vehicles like a Nexo or a Mirai. In those vehicles, sometimes it feels like the throttle response is a little bit duller than you'd expect, especially since it's essentially an electric vehicle. But remember, it's an electric vehicle where the battery output has to ramp. It takes a little bit of time for that fuel cell stack to go from 0 to 100% output. Here, you still take time for the fuel cell stack to go to 100%, but if I floor it, I get much more instant acceleration because of the bigger battery pack in the rear. After that initial punch, you will then feel a little bit of a delay as the power rolls on as the fuel cell stack gets going. But it's a much smoother experience than in the other fuel cell vehicles available currently. And of course, if you live in an area like I do, where there are a lot of hills, a lot of mountain passes, etc., the bigger battery pack means you have the ability to continue regenerating as you go down the hill. And that's certainly something that I noticed driving my own Nexo from the Bay Area to Tahoe in California. Going back down towards the Bay Area, you're relying on the friction brakes for a lot of that journey downhill. This is certainly a use case for those various drive modes. If you start off in the Bay Area and your battery wasn't completely full, you could charge your battery before you got to the mountains, and that way you'd have 174 horsepower all the way up the hill. No problem hill climbing. And you could also use those drive modes to make sure that you had used your entire battery before you started going back home, so that way you could regenerate all the way back down the hill to the Bay Area, and you'd definitely be saving a lot on your brakes. It's a bit difficult to talk about efficiency and range since I haven't been driving this at home, but so far it appears that 30 miles of electric range is totally possible. And as far as hydrogen fuel cell efficiency goes, we've been averaging 86 miles per kilogram so far. That's about average for a fuel cell vehicle so far. So they haven't made any huge strides as far as efficiency of the fuel cell system itself goes, but they have really worked on the rest of the experience here. We'll dive into a lot of that in a separate video again, so be sure and stay tuned. Unfortunately, at this point in time, I don't have any pricing or availability information on the new plug-in fuel cell CRV just yet, so be sure and stay tuned. Hopefully I will have that in the coming months or so. We do know, however, this is only going to be leased like the Clarity before it. You won't be able to buy one. You can buy a Nexo or a Mirai, so if you're interested in that, check over there. They have said that pricing will be comparable to some of those other alternatives. We don't know exactly what that means, but again, lease only. My expectation is this is going to be somewhere in the $600 to $700 a month range. Most likely that's going to include the fuel for the period of the lease, just like we've seen from fuel cell vehicles in the past. Now, fueling, that's kind of a tricky thing. We'll talk about that in the video that's coming up at the end of this video, but it is a consideration for you if you're considering something like this. It's going to be a little bit easier in a plug-in vehicle, however, because you aren't going to need to visit the hydrogen station nearly as often. And I do really love this combination of usable electric range. 30 miles of electric range is suitable for a lot of folks out there. It means that the vehicle can be lighter. This is only about 350 pounds or so heavier than a hybrid version of the CRV. And that's a big step forward, because if they were to put a 300-mile range battery pack in this exact CRV and do no other modifications, the weight penalty would be more significant than that 350 pounds. That's one of the promises of fuel cell technology. Now, again, clearly you could make a battery electric vehicle designed from the ground up to be battery electric and not necessarily have that weight penalty. But if you want something that looks and is shaped like this, has wider tires like this, etc., fuel cell technology might make a bit of sense. Outside of California, it's logical that at some point in the future, maybe it could be offered as a lease option in Hawaii. Hawaii does have some hydrogen filling infrastructure, likely some regions in Canada as well, because Canada does have some hydrogen filling infrastructure also. It is also possible, but perhaps less likely, that some other regions around the world could see themselves in a CRV fuel cell plug-in at some point in time, but who knows what the future really holds for this technology. It is definitely being built in a low-volume specialty factory that Honda has used in the past for other specialty vehicles, so there are no wide-scale mass production plans just yet. But that's definitely one of the reasons to get something like this. And in a way, I sort of had hoped that maybe Honda would differentiate the look a bit more from the regular CRV. As you can see over here, the front end definitely looks a bit different, but it certainly looks like a member of the CRV family. It's not quite as obviously different as the Clarity was in the past. For some folks, that's going to be a problem. For others, it's not really a problem at all. The other thing that if I had a wish list that I logically would have checked off on the wish list is fuel cell stack in an Acura RDX rather than a CRV. I think that might have made a bit more sense for the positioning and the expense of the vehicle, And it's honestly, it's exclusivity, the fact that you're not really driving anything like anybody else out on the road. Let me know what you think about all that down there in the comments section below. And then of course, stay tuned for the rest of the hydrogen video. See all of you over there.